Sheila Jeffreys is a radical feminist writer and activist who has worked mainly against male violence and for lesbian feminism. She joined her first women's liberation movement group in the UK in 1973. She's the author of 11 books on issues such as the history of sexuality, lesbian feminism, prostitution, gay men's politics, beauty practices, the threat of patriarchal religion to women's rights, and the politics of transgenderism. She's a director of Women's Declaration International and is talking today on the problem with free speech.
I'm going to be talking about free speech, and I'm going to do that because I've noticed that many feminists are working in or have set up organizations that are dedicated to the promotion of something called free speech, and this worries me a bit. The development is in response to the threat posed by transvestite activism to the speech of women and feminism, and there is no doubt that transvestite activism poses a severe threat to women's freedom of expression, and I'm going to talk about that today. So the way in which women and men relate to the issue of free speech is extremely different, and that's what worries me. If we try to suggest that it might be in any way the same, and I will argue that feminists need to bear this in mind when using the concept of free speech. Men have historically campaigned for the right to freedom of speech or freedom of expression in order to take part in political struggle against oppressive systems of government. In other words, against other more powerful men. Women, on the other hand, have fought and continue to fight for the right to speak against systems of male domination that have sought to shut us down in order to control and rule us. So those things are quite different. Now, I'm going to give some examples that illustrate the big difference between men and women in relation to free speech. The first of these is the punishment of women, called the scold's bridle, which seems to have been used in the 15th to the 18th centuries in the UK and doubtless elsewhere. And in this practice, women, and of course it was always women so far as we know, were punished for speaking too much or in the wrong way by having an iron torture implement fastened on their heads with a metal bar inside, which suppressed their tongues. This seems to be the origin of the expression, hold your tongue, meaning shut up. So this is a description of how the bridle worked from a museum where the bridle was on display. Once the bridle was placed on the woman, she was then led through the streets by the beadle or chained in the market cross. Apart from the obvious fear and pain of wearing it, the bridle was intended to humiliate the wearer. Bystanders would jeer, hurl insults, throw objects, spit at, and even urinate on women whilst they were chained. And perhaps even more cruelly, a woman who was forced to wear the bridle at home as a deterrent to her children would present a terrifying picture with the distortion of her features and probable laceration of tongue and lips. This barbarous instrument of torture has the dubious honour of being responsible for the saying, hold your tongue. It's a visceral reference to the metal plate that held down a woman's tongue. This is a picture of the bridle, and there are bridles in quite a lot of museums. Of course, they take slightly different forms, and it'd be interesting to see how they did work in other areas of Europe and so on, because I'm sure they would have done so. Now, a scold bridle isn't necessary, of course, we know, in terms of the oppression of women, because there are all kinds of social mechanisms that have always been used to silence women and girls, so that in most cases they wouldn't dream of speaking up. And these are mechanisms used for women in particular. And my parents, for instance, told me that little girls should be seen and not heard, and I hid behind the sofa when we had relatives to visit, so I wouldn't make any mistakes. And there's no history really of the silencing of men or recognized methods to do so. Men are not veiled, for instance, and hidden from sight. So the next example I want to look at how freedom of speech is different for women and men is the fact that the silencing of women provides men with sexual pleasure, and a variety of gags is used for this purpose. So this is a picture of a woman in a ball gag. This is very normal. It's commonly used in BDSM, and all over the internet you will find very, very many different kinds of gags and for sale. I mean, some are tartan, for instance, some are shaped like a golf ball, and so on. So there's a lot of variety. And it has been very, very ordinary in male sexuality and what men seek to do to women. And there's a very famous book from the sexual revolution times from 1973 by Alex Comfort called The Joy of Sex. And this book was published all over the world, many, 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 many languages. So it's a guide for ordinary marital sex. This is safe. This is from a man who uses these gags, obviously, on his girlfriend. And he's saying, this is on Reddit, a Reddit thread, is it safe for women with asthma to wear a ball gag? Can you deliver the inhaler through the nose in an emergency? Just wondering, e.g., if it takes time and I end up fumbling the lock. Well, the situation actually is that he might be able to kill his girlfriend in this way, because there is no way that he would be able to use this with a woman with asthma safely. But I think this just shows how ordinary it is, and how men see themselves as probably kindly for taking some care to actually not kill their girlfriends in these ways. Yes, this is what he has to say in 1973. So this is ordinary sex all over the world, just normal. Gagging and being gagged turns most men on. Most women profess to hate it in prospect, but the expression of erotic astonishment on the face of a well-gagged woman when she finds she can only mew is irresistible to most men's rape instincts. So what's interesting about this quote, which I have in my book Anti-Climax, is that he starts off saying gagging and being gagged turns most men on, and then he goes straight to why that is the case, because women profess to hate it, but they look absolutely terrified when they're gagged and they cannot speak. So it seems to me this is a very, very different relationship that men and women have to being silenced, when it is this sort of punishment and restriction of women is sexually exciting to men, but there's not really any suggestion that women would be in a position to gag men in this way, or that it would be exciting for women to do so. Now, I want to go on to talk about then, having established that it is very different for men and women, to think about the history of feminism and free speech, because there is quite a big history of this, and which some may not be so well aware of. So the right to what came to be called freedom of expression, of course, but is in the American Constitution called freedom of speech, so it's called different things in different places, was a fundamental goal of political movements against the overweening powers of the state throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And the upshot of this was that this right was seen as vital when the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, or Declaration of Human Rights, was created in 1948. And it's in the 1966 Convention on Civil and Political Rights, in which Article 19 says that the right to hold and freely express opinions without interference is a fundamental right. Now, that's all very noble, but as with all the other rights that exist in the original UN conventions, only the rights of men were meant, and only in relation to the powers of the state. Most of what men do to women was not included because it's done in private by men who are partners of those women, and it's not something that's carried out by the state, it's carried out by men. Now, the feminists who created the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in 1979 included freedom of expression. They stated that women should have the same speech rights as men. And we include freedom of expression in our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. It's Article 4 in there, which is based on Article 19 of the ICCPR. But there's a very different kind of right, apart from the right to speak out politically about changing the political situation in a state, which is what I'm going to call today men's right to talk dirty about women. And that's, of course, largely achieved now. It's a specifically masculine right, and men have campaigned for it for a very long time. That means talking dirty means, i.e., in degrading sexual terms about women. For instance, when men went to the smoking room after dinner in grand houses, they looked at early forms of pornography there, and they talked about prostitution. And this was not just pleasurable and sexually exciting, but enabled them to bond through their hatred of women. And I've just finished reading, for instance, a most remarkable book called Wifedom by Anna Funder about Eileen, the wife of George Orwell. And Funder makes it clear that not only did he use prostituted girls and women in many, many countries, but he also enjoyed talking about their use with other men. He liked to talk dirty. He liked to talk about what the teenage girls that he bought in Morocco, for instance, smelt and felt like. So it's important, I think, that we know that great male heroes of social justice like to talk dirty just as other men do. So talking dirty has always been vital to men, but not especially seen as respectable, not usually seen as respectable in public places in front of women. And that all changed in the mid-20th century. In the 20th century, men who wrote literary pornography and male campaigners for free speech conducted a fierce and successful campaign to lift all restrictions from men's right to talk dirty about women in public. And I wrote about this in my chapter on decensorship in my book Anticlimax in 1990. I argued that the so-called sexual revolution, i.e. the realization of men's sex right to use women as freely as they wished in the 1960s, had to be preceded by the removal of censorship of men's sexual writing about women. And they campaigned for novels such as Lolita, which normalized the sexual use of young teenage girls, Lady Chatterley's Lover, which romanticized the degradation of an upper-class woman by a gamekeeper through anal sex, the novels of Henry Miller, and so on. These provided the text for the revolution. They released men's right to show hatred towards women and sexually degrade women. And they consisted of the sexual exploitation of minors and hatred of women of quite an extreme kind. Now, this campaign for men to be able to talk dirty about women was called a campaign against censorship and for free speech. And no distinction was made at the time as to whose speech was involved and what kind of speech this was. The right to talk dirty about women, for instance, was not something that women sought, and they didn't want the right to talk dirty about men. So the pinnacle of these men's success was when the UK theatre critic, Kenneth Tynan, said the word F-U-C-K in a live debate on BBC television in 1965, a crucial moment in free speech. He said, "I doubt if there are any rational people to whom the word F-U-C-K would be particularly diabolical, revolting, or totally forbidden." He was a darling of the left and those who saw themselves as progressive, as all these writers and campaigners for free speech did. In fact, of course, my mother was horrified by the word F-U-C-K at the time, and I am now. I don't ever say it, but I spell it out. And when I was lecturing and had to use that word, I would spell it out, because the word has attached to it a particular vicious and pointed violence against women. It's not a neutral word. Rarely do people seriously talk about women, F-U-C-K-I-N-G, men. It means to penetrate, preferably with considerable force, a woman's body. And it's so freighted with hatred of women that I can't use it innocently, although I know many do. So the words C-U-N-T and F-U-C-K are the words of men's liberation. Their liberation to treat women as despicable and as pure sex. And women are seen as ridiculous prudes if they object to these forms of speech. There are no words of this kind that women do or can use against men that are freighted with sexual hatred of men. There are not such words. So the idea of free speech and its inviolability was used to justify pornography, both in its textual and visual form. It was the basis of the pornography revolution. All of it was part of men's sexual rights justified by free speech. In the 1970s, after decensorship was achieved, the industry of pornography took off. Now men's speech about women in the form of pornography is completely free. They have come a long way with their rights. And of course, men's pornography is political speech, but not usually understood as such. It's the propaganda of woman hating, and it's a mainstay of the continued subordination of women in the present. And all states protect it pretty much as a form of freedom of expression. They don't exactly use those terms, but no states seriously try to do anything about pornography, not really. They say it's too difficult and so on. Now, I want to go on to talk about how the speech of pornography and other men's sexual literature is defended. They say that they talk about something called the marketplace of ideas. This is very much talked about in the 50s and 60s by male liberals in their defense and their campaigns. Behind the promotion of free speech is the idea of the marketplace of ideas. And they said that free speech was fair to everyone because everyone had an equal right to set out their stall in the marketplace of ideas, and this right should be protected. This is, of course, an absurd idea because though everybody may have an equal right, there's no way that everyone has an equal opportunity. Women have been excluded from all forms of media and are still unlikely to control newspapers and other media channels. Media is controlled by money on a scale not usually available to women. In order for women to have an equal opportunity to take part in the marketplace of ideas, girls would have to be trained from birth to take part equally and speak. And currently, men dominate all conversation, let alone other kinds of speech. Women would have to be equally prominent and controlling of all forms of media to do this. For such equality to exist, women's ideas, thoughts, and feelings about themselves, their bodies, and the world would have to have equal salience to those of men. And of course, it's quite difficult to imagine this at the moment. In relation to pornography, the marketplace idea makes no sense at all. Some men do reply to feminist critique of porn by saying, well, you can do it too, create your own porn. And indeed, some women, particularly those who've been abused in porn and prostitution themselves, have created porn, ostensibly for lesbians or for men, using other women who are trying to survive in the industry. There's no industry of porn, however, created of boys and men for other women by women. There's no industry of porn in which the prolapsed anuses of young men and boys are displayed for women to masturbate to. You see the problem. Porn is, as Kathleen Lowrey says, the propaganda of woman hatred, and this hatred is very sexually exciting to the men who are happy to shut themselves in their room and masturbate to it for hours. It's not possible to imagine women creating an industry of films and photos of young men because women are not sexually excited by the degradation of boys, and there's not a plentiful supply of teenage boys to enter the industry for them. So porn is created out of the sexualization of women's oppression, and the opposite is not possible for women, because men are not sexually exploited. Now, pornography feminists have always said silences women. It's a form of the silencing. In the US in particular, male pornography campaigners and producers argued in defense of porn using the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which protects free speech. And such a defense wasn't quite as easy in Britain because there isn't a constitution. Now, US feminists who campaigned to end pornography had to develop arguments that would fight this idea that it was about free speech. I'm going to use some arguments from Catherine McKinnon's book, Only Words, which is specifically written in opposition to the view that pornography is about free speech. So it's taking part in that particular American argument. And she makes some useful arguments. She says, for instance, that pornography is not only words, or not only words in the sense that it doesn't matter. She says social inequality is substantially created and enforced. That is done through words and images. a sign saying speak whites only is only words. Words unproblematically treated as acts in the inequality context include you're fired, help wanted, male. Sleep with me and I'll give you an A, fuck me or you're fired. And she says that pornography silences women. With pornography, men masturbate to women being exposed, humiliated, violated, degraded, mutilated, dismembered, bound, gagged, tortured, and killed. She argues, and feminists have argued, that this silences women. Women are unable to have the power of serious, ordinary speech in the way that men do in this context. For instance, if women want to stand up in Parliament and speak, if they want to speak in a meeting, the men in that meeting will have probably spent many hours that day or that week looking at women degraded in terrible ways and often tortured. So women are not in a position to have equal speech in that situation. So I'm going to give some examples of the effect of pornography on women's speech. This is a poster used in the election campaign in 2013 in Australia, where Julia Gillard was facing a man called Tony Abbott in an election to be Prime Minister. This is Julia, and it says "Sack the Crack." This is a poster that was used publicly in the election campaign. Crack is a word that was obviously meaning women. It must be the way that men talk about women, but most of us don't know how men talk dirty about women. We don't know the words they use, but that obviously I would say relates to women's genitals. This is Tony Abbott, who became the Prime Minister, in front of a poster which says Julia, because she was called Julia. And she was called Bob Brown's bitch. Bob Brown was a Greens party senator. He was much hated, a gay man. But that was seen as completely reasonable to be in front of that poster. This is a cartoon created by Larry Pickering. He was the most famous cartoonist and of the major newspaper in Australia. He did hundreds of these things. I don't know if they were published in the newspaper, but he did them for his own pleasure. Obviously, they were published somewhere. So this is Julia Gillard naked with a dildo, and it says, "Time for your daily briefing, Bob." So he was a gay man, so this was seen as funny. And the daily briefing would be, where the party leaders talk to each other. So that was supposed to how this was supposed to happen. So the question I'm asking really is whether it's possible for women to have equal speech in a situation where the context is created by pornography, created by this terrible hatred of them. Clearly that wasn't possible in Australia. And it's a good question as to whether it would be possible in other countries in a way that it was not there. Now, the feminist interest in free speech is the result of the new campaign against our speech by transvestite activists. But the men who promote free speech are most generally quite conservative men and would probably never imagine that their use and love of pornography is anything but admirable. So there's a powerful contradiction here. The onslaught, though, of transvestite activism has created a new and extremely severe threat to women's freedom of expression, as we explain in the Women's Declaration. It does look as if the transvestite activists didn't expect women to speak out against them, but women did on a huge scale, and we continue to, and they didn't expect this trouble. So in response to our determination to speak out, to say that, yes, we are actually women and that matters, and so on, they have developed various ways of attacking us, and we have heard about many of these ways on Feminist Question Time, so we probably don't need to go through them all here. They have, of course, created their new language, gender, which means their sexual fantasy of sexual masochism, and many other forms of language that make it very difficult for women to speak about themselves, to describe their own bodies and their own concerns, and so on. They have developed all kinds of methods of trying to control our speech and get rid of our speech, and we know many, many examples of them. But another way, of course, that they try to fight us is in the form of insults and threats of rape, threats of murder, online and social media, on placards at our protests, on our office doors. Now, Presently, there is no easy way to counter this, not that there would be an easy way, because women are not a category in the legislation that has been and is continuing to be rolled out on hate speech and hate crime. Women aren't there. So we don't have that kind of recourse that men in various categories might have. So I'm just going to say something about hate speech. The exclusion of women from hate crime and hate speech laws is extraordinary. It's a deliberate exclusion, because the categories included are usually those that states cover in their equality and anti-discrimination laws, where sex is, up till now, generally included. So there's a determined act of power involved to remove women from this list. They know women should be there, but they determinedly remove them. And some feminists have argued that the category of sex should be included, and some feminists have said that we shouldn't seek to achieve this because hate crimes against women are best dealt with through other laws which specifically target them, such as stalking, assault, sexual harassment, and so on. They pointed out that the great majority of crimes against women are carried out in the home by intimates, and hate crime laws are directed acts carried out in public space, so they wouldn't be suitable. Another criticism of these laws that some feminists have made is that the reason that women are targeted for violence and abuse is not a form of individual hate, so women shouldn't be in there. They're not suitable for women, but it's systemic misogyny. And they say that, women are not attacked because some individuals have an unreasonable prejudice against a particular social group. So these laws are perhaps not really suitable. And a good example, though, of the fact that men are likely to use these laws, there's not a great deal of evidence that they're using them yet in the countries that have very recently put them through. But a good example of the way that transvestites are likely to use them is the fact that men in the UK, for instance, transvestites are constantly using the law against women. It was revealed last week that the man Anthony Halliday, who has pursued Caroline Farrow under the name Stephanie Hayden for a long time and made her life a misery, is a registered child sex offender who pleaded guilty in 1999 to 2 offences against a 14-year-old boy. A couple of years later was in court for assaulting a man in a car park over a parking space. This is the type of transvestite who is presently harassing women in the UK by using the law. England doesn't yet have hate crime legislation. Scotland, as we'll see in a moment, does. In 2022, Caroline had a knock on the door as she was preparing roast chicken for her family's evening meal when 2 police arrived to arrest her. And the harassment of her has been persistent and gone on a long time. And this particular man has done this he's taken legal action against 24 people and filed 40 complaints, including against the Mail on Sunday. So this is this paedophile. So there are many, unfortunately, transvestite vexatious litigants like him seeking to make women's lives a misery and dragging them through the courts in many other countries, as we know from these seminars such as Norway, Sweden, Germany, Brazil. And where once the problem for women was managing to get their speech heard, it is now that they will be harshly punished for expressing their opinions about women's sex-based rights and biological reality. So it's not exactly a scourge bridle now, but these men are using the law in every way they can, and it's likely that they will use hate crimes legislation, and this is why they are pushing for hate crimes legislation. So I'm just going to talk for a moment about hate crimes legislation in Scotland, which went through in 2021. This is the 2021 law. New law creates an offence of behaving in a threatening, abusive, or insulting manner, or communicating in a similar manner to another person in a way which intends to stir up hatred against a group of persons and covers age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. And it also creates the offence of inflammatory material. Now, what is interesting about this is there's something interesting in here. Look at sex characteristics. Sex characteristics, which is a terminology that the transvestite activists seek to get into all legislation. appears to mean, they say it means intersexuality. So it would mean a man who presumably, because male is generally the predominant underlying sex of those seen as intersexual, would be protected in going with the penis into the women's toilets. Sex characteristics doesn't mean sexual characteristics that women may have, because women are not in the legislation. And the bill does, however, allow for women to be added as a category at a later date. Isn't that nice? You know, they might need to add women in. The problem is, of course, women are half the population, and those who do not want to add women into this legislation pretty much everywhere say if women were added in, it would explode the idea of hate speech. Yes, it would, and perhaps it should, because obviously women are those who are most likely to and do suffer all of this, and pornography would be a problem as well, and so on. So maybe hate crime legislation, hate speech legislation is entirely unsuitable, because if it can't include women, then how is it useful? If it can't include the most serious problem that we have. Another interesting problem with the Scottish bill, as with all bills of this kind, is that, well, not necessarily, no, actually this is a new problem. It's a problem with this bill in particular. The man who is now the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, he was the Secretary of State for Justice who got this bill through. And he said it was important that this bill would cover what happened at the dining table. So in your living room, your children might say to their father, no, of course you're not a woman, you're obviously a man, you're our dad. That could, in theory, who knows, fall within this bill, because it's supposed to cover what's going on inside the home. That's unusual, because normally hate speech covers what happens outside. And indeed, around the Scottish legislation, the whole issue of the fact that women were not there but transvestites was brought up. The spokeswoman of the feminist group For Women Scotland, Susan Smith, said she was concerned the definition included men who were transvestites, with the effect that you get this bizarre situation that something being done for arousal is protected under hate crime legislation, but women are not there. So there's a protection of a sexual fantasy and men who don't want to be offended by having their sexual fantasy called into question, but actual real women, like those cartoons about Julia Gillard, for instance, are not within this legislation. When feminists set up, let's just think about whether it's okay to be setting up free speech organizations or joining them. I know lots of women are, and I don't want to be, especially critical. I understand exactly why women are, because in this situation, you would feel you needed to do something. But when feminists set up free speech organizations or join those already set up by men, we are hostages in a way. We're wanting to use the influence that those men, often very establishment and conservative men, wield on the issue of free speech to help protect ourselves. And these men are often happy to support our cause of being able to speak about biology. And they can be very useful to us in that way. And some are prepared to recognize that it's women who are particularly attacked for using our speech. But they're very unlikely to be interested in countering the speech that the talking dirty they probably use in their homes and behind a bedroom door in the evening and so on, which is using pornography in which women are being sexually tortured. They're very unlikely to want to do anything about that. So I think we've got a contradiction at the end. We can use these men about certain kinds of speech that they are prepared to, and we are often very pleased that they are prepared to defend, but the other forms of speech that they want to use about women, they are certainly not going to see those as in any way harmful to us. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.